The Battle of Casablanca, Americans. Vice, Americans Part 1, The Fog of War, November 1942. The Atlantic greeted an armada of more than 100 American ships with leaden waves and bone-chilling winds. Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landing in North Africa, was in full swing. Its goal was to knock Vichy France, Germany's ally, out of the war and create a springboard for an attack on the soft underbelly of Europe. Aboard the transports, rocking in the heavy ocean swell, were thousands of young American men, many of whom were experiencing their first baptism of fire. Among them were the crew of the destroyer Ludlow and soldiers of the 1st Armored Division. Aboard the transport Leedstown, the air was thick with anticipation and fear. Through the roar of the wind and storm, fragments of radio chatter and the anxious voices of officers issuing final orders could be heard. The plan seemed simple: land near Casablanca, quickly suppress the French who, as headquarters hoped, would not seriously resist their liberators, and establish control of Morocco. The Ludlow's captain, Commander James Easton, stood on the bridge, peering at the shore looming through the rain. His ship, nimble and well-armed, was part of the covering force. Its mission was to ensure the safety of the landing craft, suppress the shore batteries, and be ready to repel an attack by the French fleet should it venture out of the harbor. Easton, an experienced officer, sensed the trap. Everything was too chaotic. The radio airwaves were clogged with static and overlapping messages in English and poor French. The coastal maps were inaccurate, and most importantly, visibility was appalling. Meanwhile, on the deck of the transport Leedstown, a different kind of bustle reigned. Troopers, loaded with equipment, lined up along the sides, preparing to launch the boats. Among them was Lieutenant William Will Carter, the tank platoon commander. His Shermans, securely secured in the hold, awaited their turn. Will, a West Point graduate, was eager to fight. He believed in the clarity of orders and the coherence of the American military machine. For him, war was a tactical textbook that had to be implemented. He looked at his men young, frightened, but trying not to show it, and felt a sense of responsibility. He had to lead them to victory with minimal losses. The first hours of the operation only added to the chaos. The landing began with delays. The boats lost course in the fog and waves, some capsized. French coastal batteries, loyal to the Vichy government, opened harassing fire. Their resistance proved far more fierce than expected. Air duels broke out between American Wildcats and French Dewoitines. All this created confusion as thick as the morning fog over Casablanca. It was at this moment, with nerves frayed to the breaking point and the battlefield resembling a blurry watercolor painting, that the first fatal coincidence occurred. Will Carter's group of tanks, having finally reached the shore on their barges, began moving toward their designated beach heads. They moved along the beach, their green silhouettes barely discernible in the smoke and pre-dawn gloom. On the bridge of the Ludlow, a signalman, his eyes aching from the constant strain, reported a suspicious accumulation of vehicles on the beach. In poor visibility, smoke, and chaos, the silhouettes of the Shermans were mistaken for French tanks. Commander Easton, acting on his own discretion under orders to destroy any threat to the landing force, gave an order that would forever haunt him: main battery guns, target tanks on the beach, fire. The destroyer's first salvo missed, sending up a spray of water and sand. Will Carter, leaning out of his tank's hatch, couldn't believe his eyes. Shells were exploding from the sea. From the sea. He immediately tried to get on the air. Cease fire. We are friendly. I repeat, we are American tanks. But his radio transmission was drowned out by the general chaos. Static, shouts, orders. His voice was just one of hundreds. The Ludlow's second salvo was accurate. One of the Shermans shuddered and was enveloped in black smoke. Will saw the hatch open, and its gunner, a young man from Ohio, struggled to climb out. He was burning. The screams he heard weren't pain, but bewilderment and horror. They were dying not from the enemy, but from the fire of their own ships. The war, which a moment ago had been a textbook tactical exercise, had turned into an absurd, surreal hell. This wasn't a battle. This was a killing by mistake. The fog of war thickened to an impenetrable, bloody darkness. Part 2. Chain reaction of calls news that their own were taking fire, spread like wildfire across the beach. First disbelief, then shock, and then blind, furious panic. Will Carter's tankers, just preparing to attack the French positions, found themselves trapped between enemy fortifications and the fire of their own fleet. They scurried along the beach, trying to find cover in the folds of the terrain. But the 50-ton Shermans were too big a target. Will, his face greasy and sooty from the nearby explosion, shouted into the radio microphone over and over again, trying to reach anyone. He changed the frequency, trying to contact the landing command post, the flagship. Cease fire. You're taking fire on your own. This is the 1st Armored. Damn it. Someone respond. The only response was a hiss of static and distant, distorted voices issuing unrelated orders. The communication system, the nerve center of any modern army, was paralyzed by the scale of the operation and the prevailing confusion. Meanwhile, on the Ludlow, Commander Easton received the first report from an observer on shore, who had finally spotted the tank's markings. A chilling terror gripped him. He ordered an immediate ceasefire, but it was too late. Several American tanks burned on the sand, and the surviving crew scattered in terror, seeking shelter from the deadly rain from the sea. Easton stood on the bridge, white as a sheet, gripping the handrail so tightly that his knuckles were white. He had just killed his own men. In the name of saving the landing party, he had dealt them one of the most terrible blows. But the tragedy on the beach was only the first act of this bloody farce. Chaos, like a chain reaction, began to spread across the entire theater of operations. American coastal artillery crews, which had landed earlier to cover the main forces, were scattered around Casablanca. Their mission was to suppress the French shore batteries and prevent enemy ships from breaking out of the harbor. One of these crews, under the command of a young and eager Lieutenant Frank Miller, took up a position on one of the hills overlooking the waters. His men deployed a powerful 155 mm gun. Visibility remained abysmal. Smoke from fires, fog, and wave spray mixed, creating a milky gray shroud, and then the silhouette of a large ship appeared on the horizon. It was heading for the landing zone. Lieutenant Miller, using an inaccurate map and mindful of briefings about possible sorties by French warships from the harbor, made a fateful decision. He was sure he saw an enemy cruiser or transport, attempting to either reinforce the garrison or attack the landing craft. Target large ship bearing 075, load with high explosive shells, he commanded, his voice trembling with excitement and nervous tension. The crew, made up of the same green recruits as himself, rushed to carry out the order. They had no doubt. They were at war. They had seen the enemy. The blast from the powerful gun stunned them. The shell missed its mark. The ship, rocked by the nearby explosion, began to maneuver desperately. It was the USS Leedstown, the very transport that had carried Will Carter's tank platoon a few hours earlier. Now it carried the wounded, personnel, and reserve units. The Leedstown began to frantically signal, trying to signal its allies. But the IFF system was primitive at the time, and in the chaos of battle, it simply didn't work. Lieutenant Miller, seeing the ship's maneuvers, interpreted them as an attempt to evade fire and attack. He's escaping. Hit and kill. He shouted. The second shot was accurate. The shell struck the Leedstown amidships. A deafening explosion followed by the explosion of ammunition or fuel tanks. The ship was enveloped in a black-orange cloud of fire and smoke. It began to list rapidly. Minutes later, the transport, carrying hundreds of American soldiers and officers, disappeared beneath the water. The cries of the wounded and drowning men mingled with the hissing of steam and the crackling of burning wreckage. Lieutenant Miller descended from the observation post to better examine the impact of his hit. And just as the water began to swallow the last of the ship's wreckage, he saw American helmets washed ashore, boxes of equipment with recognizable markings, and life jackets emblazoned with the stars and stripes. His face, a moment ago beaming with success, became completely blank. He slowly sank to his knees and vomited. He hadn't destroyed the enemy. He had sunk his ship. He had just sent hundreds of his comrades to the bottom. Asterisk, the news of the sinking of the Leedstown and the shelling of tanks by their own artillery spread like lightning throughout the entire unit. The shock was deafening. Command tried to bring the situation under control, but panic and confusion had already taken their toll. American ships and shore batteries, fearing a repeat of the incident, became overly cautious, missing real targets. The French, seeing chaos in the enemy ranks, increased their resistance. By the end of the day, American losses from friendly fire 340 men exceeded those from Vichy French forces. The coast near Casablanca was strewn with the wreckage of American equipment, destroyed by the Americans themselves. This was not a battle, but a vivid demonstration of how the best laid plans can be shattered by the harsh realities of war. Poor communications, human error, and that very fog of war that Karl von Clausewitz called a commander's main enemy. War was no longer an abstraction. It became a fratricidal massacre on a foreign shore. Part 3. The bitterness of victory and the burden of memory on the next day. Revealed a horrific scene. The beaches near Casablanca were strewn with the charred hulks of Sherman tanks, shell craters from American destroyers, and the bodies of fallen soldiers in American uniforms. The sea where the Leedstown had foundered was covered in an oily film, debris, and lonely floating life rafts, some of which held silent, shocked survivors. The air, once filled with the roar of engines and the rumble of cannon fire, was now heavy with silence, broken only by the cries of seagulls and the muffled groans of the wounded. Lieutenant Will Carter, his uniform stained with mud and stains not his own, wandered among what remained of his platoon. Of the 5 tanks, only one remained intact. He found the bodies of his men, that gunner from Ohio, the young driver from Texas, who had bragged about a photograph of his fiancée all morning before landing. They hadn't died in honorable combat. They had been killed by a monstrous, absurd mistake. Guilt, bitterness, and rage choked him. Had he saved the country from his own people? A deathly silence reigned on the bridge of the destroyer Ludlow. Commander Easton didn't close his eyes. He knew he had acted within the bounds of combat necessity, but that knowledge brought no comfort. He ordered lifeboats lowered to help pick up the survivors of the Leedstown, the very people he had indirectly fought against. The sight of the burned, terrified young faces being hoisted aboard his ship was worse than any court-martial verdict. Lieutenant Frank Miller, whose gun crew sank the Leedstown, was found by his own men, motionless on a rock, staring into space. He was relieved of command and sent to the rear. For him, the war was over almost before it had begun, leaving him with a burden he would have borne for the rest of his days. Despite horrific losses from friendly fire, Operation Torch was largely a success. The resistance of the Vichy French forces was broken, and Casablanca fell. But the victory that day did not feel like a triumph. It was bitter and pyrrhic. Official reports sent to Washington dryly stated, "Landing successful, enemy repulsed. Casualties such and such, including accidents and friendly fire." The phrase friendly fire sounded like an ominous oxymoron, behind which lay hundreds of lost lives. The story of the Battle of Casablanca was not widely known. Army censors did everything possible to keep this tragic page out of the newspapers. Why undermine the nation's morale and air its dirty linen in public? War is war. Mistakes happen. For the survivors of those events, the war did not end with the surrender of Germany and Japan. Will Carter fought throughout Europe, becoming an experienced officer, but he never forgot that beach near Casablanca. At night, he dreamed of burning Sherman tanks in the faces of his men. He survived, but a part of him remained forever on that sand. Commander Easton continued to serve, but his career, according to rumors, was no longer as illustrious. The shadow of Ludlow and that fateful order forever tainted his reputation. Lieutenant Miller was discharged for mental health reasons. He returned to the States, but was never able to find his place. He died relatively young, according to his family, never having forgiven himself. The Battle of Casablanca was a brutal but necessary lesson for the American military. It dramatically demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of communication breakdowns and inadequate training for troop coordination in challenging conditions. Following this incident, the U.S. Army and Navy implemented extensive reforms. Identification, friend or foe systems were improved, communications protocols were tightened, and officers and enlisted personnel were better trained to fight in conditions of poor visibility and general chaos. The tragedy at Casablanca was not in vain. The bitter experience, bought with the blood of 340 soldiers, ultimately saved thousands of other lives in subsequent battles of the war. But for those who were there, this was small consolation. They remained forever captives of that foggy morning in November 1942, when Americans, by chance, fate, and circumstance, fought a battle against themselves, learning from experience that the most terrifying enemy in war isn't always the one on the other side of the front. Sometimes it's born of chaos, fear, and error, staring at you from the deck of your own ship or through the sights of your own gun.